Hi, welcome to Risk Management. Today we're going to talk about the topic of inferior data. This is carrying on from our last talks, which you'll recall dealt with the issue of RCTs, randomized controlled trials. For those issues, we recognize that RCTs are generally considered the gold standard in creating causal knowledge. When we randomize and control for confounders, bias, and chance, we generally have a good chance of learning causal things. However, we don't always have the luxury, either because of expense, time, or simple lack of study, that such RCTs exist. And where there's an absence of RCTs, the question arises: if we have some data that purport to be about a certain topic, can we in fact know anything about causation? So today we'll start that topic questioning, do data without an RCT still give us knowledge? In other words, another way of asking this question is, are large-scale RCTs the only way to gain knowledge about causation, or risks in turn, since we know that risks are based on causation, as we've seen in a number of previous lectures? And the answer is not really. There are other ways to gain knowledge, but we're always trying to seek knowledge as perfectly as possible. Remember, even with RCTs, we don't completely eliminate chance, and there are potential biases that can creep in. Just because somebody uses the phrase RCT doesn't mean we should bow down and conclude that the study was done correctly. We'd have to roll up our sleeves and make sure that there was effective randomization, effective controls, effective power, and many other variables that are all having to be considered before we conclude that the trial was in fact an effective RCT. But one statement I want to leave us to start with is the test of all knowledge is experiment. Experiment is the sole judge of scientific truth. This is from Richard Feynman, Nobel Prize winner. And what did Feynman mean when he said this, that all knowledge is gained through experiment? Well, I want to suggest that one of the things that's very essential when we gain knowledge is there has to be some element of what's called manipulation, actually controlling a certain variable to test whether or not the removal of that variable or the inclusion of it affects an outcome, and therefore whether that variable is a stimulus leading to a certain effect, and therefore whether causation exists, and in the case of risks, whether a risk exists. There's a nice experimental study that Feynman describes in a lecture. You can get this online if you Google cargo cult science. It was a talk he gave at the Caltech commencement address back in 1974. And in this paper that Feynman talks about is a study by a man named Young in 1937, who was trying to do experiments involving rats running through cages, where he wanted them to have cheese as a reward at the end of a certain maze. And there were several different doors, only one of which presented cheese. Now, it was important for the experiments that Young wanted to do that the rats not be able to know in advance which door had the cheese. The problem was that when he was setting up the perimeters and the parameters for this experiment, he noticed that in fact the rats seemed to find the cheese even ahead of time. And he wondered, well, why is that? I haven't even started my experiment. So he maintained the conditions that he had intended for his experiment, and one variable at a time, he tried to figure out how it was that the rats consistently could find cheese behind a door that was not open. And so he first tried to control for smell and thought maybe there's odors in here, and so he would try to control for the odor. And then he thought maybe it's the sound I make when I put the cheese behind a certain door. Or maybe it's the fact that the rats remember which way they run through the maze, and so they consistently go to the door where they remembered the cheese. And he studied all sorts of different conditions, one after the next, holding everything else constant, trying to figure out how it was that rats were in fact finding cheese. He was manipulating the experiment, one variable at a time, holding everything else constant so he could identify the specific cause of the rats being able to find the cheese. What he ultimately ended up discovering was that it was the sound of the rats' own movement scratching along the floors that was guiding them to the door with the cheese behind it. And this was an important discovery because movement sound was therefore a proven confounder in his experiments. And if he had not controlled for it, it would have messed up his future experiments, and the mice would have been assumed to have been able to not find the cheese on their own. And so This was, in some ways, Feynman described an A-plus experiment, not because this is what Young set out to do, but because as a background, as a baseline for his future experiments, he needed to understand how rats run through mazes and how they find cheese. And by doing that, future experiments that built on this were effective and not building upon a house of cards. So the conclusion was that when Young tested one variable at a time using the same rat each time, he found the cause of the rat's behavior. This is an example of what we would call effective experimental manipulation. And this is a very important thing because you will see in future lectures that we hold here that a number of different so-called studies that are supposedly revealing of causal knowledge lack this element of manipulation, of scientific control of a variable, where the change is affected by the researcher and not simply something that is observed. So one way you might say what Feynman's saying is there's no causation without manipulation. Here's a nice Far Side cartoon that gets at the same thing as what Feynman has just said, where the man's on an operating table and they say, whoa, that was a good one. Try it, Hobbs. Just poke his brain right where my finger is. So even all good scientists in jest and in humor can recognize what it is that they're actually doing, that there's no causation without experiment. And one of the things, just to go back to a slide we've seen before when we were talking about randomized trials, what are we doing with manipulation and randomization? Well, we're getting rid of confounders by having the same confounders in both the manipulated version of the experiment as well as in the controlled version where we left out the manipulation, as well as the manipulation itself. So watch. Here we have on one half of this diagram manipulation versions of the experiment, where there's a bunch of different factors all contributing to the effect, A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. And then in the control version of this, we have likewise the same confounders. We know they're the same because by randomizing, we've effectively placed the same confounders in both the manipulated form of the study as well as the control form of the study. So A, B, C, E, F, and G are also in the control study. What's not in the control version of the study is the variable that we want to select as interesting, D in this case. So A, B, C, E, F, and G cancel themselves out, but what we're left with is the direct effect of D on the effect. And so we can measure by an experiment that's randomized and controlled the true effect of D on the effect of interest. This idea has been carried over to much of the scientific and economic literature. And so, for example, Richard Peto, who we saw before when we were dealing with the aspirin and heart attack studies, Richard Peto says the following, and this is a fairly startling claim. He says, there's simply no scientific alternative to the generation of large-scale randomized evidence. Now think of that for a moment. How many studies you read about every day making claims about risks existing or risks not existing? And so are we to believe that if there's no large-scale randomized trial, that we cannot know anything about it? That's the subject of today's talk when we're talking about inferior data. Data that come from studies that are not an RCT. So is that right? Is Peto's claim that we need an RCT to know things true? And here's some examples where I can pretty much assure you there's not been RCTs done on these topics, and yet you might seem silly to claim that we don't have knowledge of these issues. For example, when we throw a baseball at a glass window and the window breaks, do we need an RCT to test that? Or that asbestos causes asbestosis? That famine causes people to die? That stabbing somebody causes a puncture wound or bleeding? That a lack of insulin can cause diabetic coma? That DDT eradicates malaria? Do we need an RCT in order to confirm these things, or can we rely on what we might call common sense? Well, we've seen already where common sense can lead us awry. We've seen some examples talking about confounders, about reverse causation, about chance, and about bias, where illusions have cropped up and we've made mistakes. So we have to be cautious not to simply write off the power of an RCT and say, well, it's not necessary. If we say it's not necessary, then we're in a position where we have to defend which times it's going to be an illusion and which times it's not, simply based on common sense. And we know that our common sense is sometimes misled. Here's one thing I want to suggest. All studies have to have what's called statistical power to generate causal knowledge. It's an essential element of having scientific knowledge. So in doing so, RCTs have statistical power. It's also the case that you can generate statistical power, which is not proving of knowledge, but is certainly highly correlated with knowledge, even in studies that are not RCTs. So let's look at a couple of examples of this to see what I'm talking about. Randomization might be unnecessary, in other words, when a causal relation has so much power, that is, that the stimulus of interest that we're looking at is either necessary or sufficient or both for the effect of interest, that the stimulus and effect relationship that's proposed is unequivocally evident, even if observed in a non-randomized or uncontrolled setting. Okay. Now that's a lot of words, but what we're basically saying is that if you have an extremely high power causal event or a risk, it may not require an RCT in order for that to be known. Here's the example I want to bring up first, DDT. This is a chemical that was introduced in many developing world countries as long ago as the 1940s to try to control the reduction of malaria, a very strong pestilence in many of these countries. Let me give you some statistics taken from these different developing countries, and you can see the power issue that came up in the statistical analysis of whether DDT was effective in eradicating malaria. In Sri Lanka in 1948, there were over 2.8 million cases of malaria among humans that year. After DDT was introduced in the mid-1950s, the number of malaria incidences in Sri Lanka went from 2.8 million to, in one year, 1963, 17. What a massive reduction. Also, what's interesting about this study is, for reasons unrelated to the actual efficacy of DDT in fighting malaria, people were concerned that DDT was causing birth defects and other human harms, and so it was banned as a substance. So after the DDT ban came into place, 1969 for example, the malaria rate in Sri Lanka went from 2.8 million down to 17, and then back up to 2.5 million when DDT was banned and there was no effective eradication of malaria left in Sri Lanka. So here you have what's called a washout study. It's a very nice example of statistical power. We introduced a chemical, we manipulated in the experiment, DDT was introduced and sprayed, and the background incidence of malaria basically dropped to zero. And then when that background incidence, when the DDT was reintroduced into the populace, then the amount of malaria went right back up to where it was before DDT was used. Same studies came out in Zanzibar, another country. 70% of the population in 1958 had malaria. After DDT was introduced by 1964, 6 years later, only 5% of the population had malaria, a 14-fold reduction. Also, when DDT was banned, after the ban, the malaria rate climbed roughly back to where it had been before DDT had been introduced. This sort of washout study of statistical power dropping and then reasserting itself is very indicative of causation, even if we don't know it in the ideal sense that we would in an RCT. Here's some, I'm just going to flash through some graphs now to show you the dramatic effects of DDT usage in these various countries in chart form. Here's an example of malaria in Sri Lanka. On the bottom axis you have the year. The key interesting line for us is the blue line, which is the number of positive cases among human beings in any given year. On the left end of the chart is the number of those cases on the vertical axis in hundreds of thousands. The other red line, just so you're aware in all of these different graphs, is the actual percentage of the falciparum and the malaria protozoa that was infecting people. That's not relevant for our study. It just happens to be part of this graph, so ignore that and only look at the blue lines. You'll see also on the timeline, midway through that first segment of the graph, there's 3 different arrow segments. The first part is the eradication era, the era in which malaria was existing and that was also being treated by DDT. And so that first left-hand part of the graph, DDT was being used to eradicate malaria. Then during the control phase, the middle segment of the graph, you have the phase out of the DDT and the return to malaria incidence among the population. So you can see we went from virtually no malaria on the left-hand end of the graph up until about 1968, and then a huge spike in the control phase where DDT was phased out from usage in Sri Lanka. The same thing occurs in other countries, in Myanmar or Burma. Look at the eradication era. We're looking again at the blue line here on your graph. And the blue line is virtually down around zero, between zero up to around maybe 18,000, up until the end of the eradication era, which looks like around 1970. And then after that, look at the stark climb in the number of positive cases, all the way up to around 140,000, or a 7 to 10-fold increase in malaria after DDT was banned. The same also happens in Nepal. Here we see the malaria incidence in the eradication era never climbing above about 7 to 8,000 and as low as zero at one point at the beginning of the graph. But then in the control era from 1971 up until around 1983, it looks like, you see a huge stark increase in the number of positive cases from zero all the way up to about 42 to 43,000. So again, we're seeing the same pattern in different countries involving the same chemical in different human populations, all of which are dealing with a specific infection of malaria. Same in Thailand. Here's the control era, the eradication era on the left of your graph, under 100,000 cases per year. Once we get to the control phase of this, where DDT has been phased out, it's all the way up into 450,000 cases a year. So the spike occurs once again after DDT is phased out. Same thing in Java and Bali. We have very low rates of malaria incidence during the DDT eradication era, and then huge spikes all the way up to about 360,000 in Java and Bali once malaria is no longer treatable with DDT. So what I want to leave you with in this first statement about inferior data, none of these studies were in fact RCTs. It's not like the scientists said, we're going to treat certain areas with DDT and not others and see what happens by randomizing where we treat with DDT. Everywhere was treated with DDT simultaneously, but what we saw was by phasing it out at different times in different places, there was a rise in the incidence of malaria as a result. So what we can tentatively conclude, and we'll come back to this, and we're going to cover this in a number of lectures now, is that often the manipulation of a suspected stimulus does not result in nearly so dramatic a difference in the effect as what you've just seen in these malaria studies. In such instances where the causal relationship is weaker, the experiment has to be more carefully done to prevent chance or confounders or bias from interfering with assessment of the possible causal relationship. In other words, you're not always going to have such ideal power situations as you do in the malaria studies. Oftentimes, the causal relationship we're studying is very weak and very attenuated, such as the heart attack and aspirin studies we were doing. Really, there was only about a 5% marginal improvement in the number of fewer heart attacks as a result of aspirin uses. It's a nuanced relationship, not a strong causal relationship. As a result, we need more scientific power to discover medium-sized or weak-sized causal relationships. And we'll come back to this in the next segment where we talk a little bit about what might this be and how might we know whether we have statistical power or not. I'll see you there, and before that, I look forward to seeing you on the chat boards.